There is something sitting in your grocery store right now, in the produce section under the fluorescent lights, probably next to the carrots and the ginger, that could do more for the walls of your arteries than the medication you've been refilling every month for the last decade. It costs less than a cup of coffee. It stains everything it touches, and the overwhelming majority of people who try it once never touch it again. But before we get to that, I need to tell you something about how the damage that causes most heart attacks and strokes after the age of 60 actually begins. Because until you understand where it starts, nothing else in this conversation is going to make complete sense. After more than 20 years working in cardiac medicine, watching patients come through recovery after catastrophic events, patients who had done every single thing they were told to do, I kept hearing the same question. The same four words, asked in the same quiet, devastated voice, from people lying in hospital beds hooked to monitors with stents freshly placed in their chests. How did this happen? These were not people who had ignored their health. These were people who had been diligent, disciplined, faithful to every instruction their doctors had given them. They had taken the statins. They had shown up for every annual checkup. They had replaced butter with the spreads their cardiologists recommended. They had walked every morning and avoided the foods they were told were dangerous. And they still ended up on a stretcher. That question deserves an honest answer. This video is that answer. The damage behind most cardiovascular events after 60 is not primarily happening in your cholesterol number. It is not being caught by your blood pressure reading at the annual appointment. It is happening inside the wall of the artery itself, in a layer so thin it is measured in individual cells, driven by a failure in a system that your doctor has almost certainly never had time to explain to you. This failure has been documented in clinical research for more than 2 decades. It has been published in some of the most respected cardiology journals in the world. And it has almost never made it into the standard 12-minute checkup because the appointment was never built around that question. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Daniel. He was 67 years old, a retired civil engineer from a mid-sized city in the American South, the kind of man who approached his health the same way he approached construction projects, methodically, by the rules, with no shortcuts. He had been taking a cholesterol medication for over a decade. He had switched from cooking with butter to using plant-based spreads sometime in the mid-90s because his physician at the time had told him they were the safer choice. He used bottled vegetable oil because the label displayed a heart symbol. He ate bran cereal every morning. He had avoided eggs for 12 years after reading that the cholesterol in them was dangerous. He walked 4 times a week without fail. His numbers, when reviewed annually, were considered acceptable. His physician was satisfied. Daniel was satisfied. He believed he was doing everything right. The cardiac event came on a Sunday evening. He was in his backyard, trimming the hedges along the fence, when a sensation like someone pressing a fist into the center of his chest stopped him entirely. By the time his daughter found him, he was seated on the ground against the fence post, pale and barely able to speak. He survived. The procedure was performed the following morning. The recovery took months, and when he finally sat across from me 3 months later, his first words were almost identical to what I had heard dozens of times before. He said he did not understand how this had happened to someone who had never missed a medication, never skipped a checkup, and never stopped following the rules. The answer I gave him was the answer I want to give you now. Not that what he had done was wrong, not that his efforts had been meaningless, but that the map he had been following had been drawn by people who did not have his best interests as their primary concern. The margarine he had been eating for 30 years was not protecting his arteries. It was contributing to the exact process that damages them. The vegetable oil he cooked with every day was introducing a type of chemically altered fat into his body that, once inside his bloodstream, turned his cholesterol into the form that burrows into artery walls and builds the deposits that eventually rupture. The eggs he had been avoiding for over a decade were never the threat he was told they were. And the information that could have changed his trajectory had been sitting in medical journals for years while nobody with a prescription pad told him about it. Here is the upstream mechanism, the one that connects all of it, the one that explains why blood pressure rises in older adults even when they're doing everything they're told to do. Your arteries are lined with a layer of cells so thin they are essentially invisible to the naked eye. These cells produce a molecule called nitric oxide, And that molecule does three things that are absolutely fundamental to cardiovascular survival. First, it tells the artery wall to relax and widen every time your heart beats. When nitric oxide is present and active, the artery behaves like a living, flexible tube. It absorbs the force of each heartbeat and releases it smoothly. When nitric oxide is absent or depleted, the artery wall stiffens. It loses its ability to flex. The heart has to push harder to move blood through a system that no longer gives way. Blood pressure rises not because of what is in the blood, but because of what is happening to the container that holds it. Second, nitric oxide acts as a biological seal along the interior surface of the artery wall. When this seal is intact, cholesterol particles traveling through the blood cannot penetrate the wall. They are chemically repelled. They pass through harmlessly. But when nitric oxide levels fall and the seal degrades, gaps open in that barrier. Cholesterol that should have kept moving begins entering the wall itself, not floating in the blood, inside the structure of the artery. That is where plaque forms, not in the bloodstream, in the wall. The cholesterol number measured on a standard blood test is measuring what is circulating past. It is not measuring what is accumulating inside. Third, nitric oxide controls the inflammatory signals that tell immune cells traveling through the blood to keep moving. When those signals are present, the immune system stays out of the artery wall. When they disappear, immune cells begin entering the wall, encountering the cholesterol that has already crossed over, attacking it, dying in place, and forming the calcified deposits that eventually rupture and trigger the event that sends someone to the emergency room. That is the complete chain. Nitric oxide falls. The wall stiffens. The seal breaks. Cholesterol penetrates. Inflammation builds. And everything that follows is a downstream consequence of that original failure. After 60, the cellular machinery that produces nitric oxide begins breaking down in a way that goes far beyond normal slowdown. It does not simply reduce output. It begins producing harmful byproducts instead of protective ones. The very system that was designed to protect your artery walls begins contributing to their deterioration. Most people over 60 have lost somewhere between 60 and 75% of their natural nitric oxide production capacity. Their statin is not addressing that. Their blood pressure medication is lowering the reading on the monitor, but is not rebuilding the machinery that should be keeping the artery wall sealed and flexible in the first place. The standard annual checkup was never designed to look there. Now here is the drink, the one I mentioned at the beginning, the one that stains your cutting board, that looks alarming in a glass, that has been shown in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials published in the American Heart Association's own journals to accomplish something that the pharmaceutical industry has no mechanism to monetize because you cannot place a patent on a vegetable. Beetroot juice. In 2015, researchers published a controlled trial in a leading hypertension journal involving 64 adults with elevated blood pressure. Half received a daily cup of beetroot juice. The other half received a placebo version with the active compounds chemically removed. After 4 weeks, the beetroot group saw their systolic blood pressure drop by an average of 8 points. Their diastolic fell by 4. For a person over 60, an 8-point systolic reduction is clinically comparable to the effect of adding a second antihypertensive medication from a vegetable. But the blood pressure drop, significant as it is, was not even the most important finding. The same study measured something called pulse wave velocity, the gold standard assessment for arterial stiffness. It measures how quickly the pressure wave from each heartbeat travels through the arterial system. In young, flexible arteries, the wave moves slowly because the walls absorb and release the energy. In stiff, rigid arteries, the wave travels dangerously fast because nothing is absorbing it. The beetroot group saw their pulse wave velocity improve by more than 0.5 meters per second, a magnitude that cardiologists associate with removing 5 to 10 years of structural aging from the arterial wall. A separate study published the following year found that daily beetroot consumption improved endothelial function, the performance of the artery lining itself, by 20%. The walls were becoming more flexible. The lining was beginning to heal. This is not wellness content. This is vascular biology published in peer-reviewed cardiology literature. The reason it works comes down to the bypass pathway. Beetroot is extraordinarily dense in inorganic nitrates. When you consume the juice, your digestive system absorbs those nitrates and routes them into your salivary glands. Your saliva concentrates them. Then bacteria living naturally on the back of your tongue convert those nitrates into nitrite compounds. When you swallow and those nitrites encounter the low oxygen environment of your stiff, narrowed arteries, they convert directly into nitric oxide, without requiring the original cellular machinery that has already broken down. The damaged enzyme is bypassed entirely. The artery receives the signal to relax whether the original system is functioning or not. This is why it works when nothing else has. It is not trying to repair the broken factory. It is building a separate entrance. There is one thing that destroys this pathway completely, and millions of people are doing it every morning without the slightest awareness of what they are losing. Antibacterial mouthwash. The bacteria on the back of your tongue that perform the conversion from nitrate to nitrite are not harmful organisms. They are essential partners in a system your body depends on. A study published in a respected free radical biology journal found that patients who used antibacterial mouthwash before consuming beetroot juice saw their blood pressure benefits eliminated entirely. Not reduced, eliminated. The bacteria were gone. The conversion could not happen. The juice became nutritionally inert with regard to the nitric oxide pathway. If you have been drinking beetroot juice or eating nitrate-rich vegetables and wondering why your blood pressure has not responded, and you're also rinsing with an antibacterial product every morning, that is your answer. Stop using it before consuming anything that relies on this pathway. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Irene. She was 71 years old, a former music teacher. She had spent her entire adult life doing what the system told her to do: low-fat foods, cooking sprays, margarine, vegetable oils with heart-healthy certification printed on the front of every bottle. She trusted the labels. She trusted the advice. She had no reason not to. One afternoon, carrying grocery bags from her car toward her kitchen door, a crushing pressure in the center of her chest stopped her in the driveway. It was not sharp. It was heavy, like something pressing down from the inside. Her vision narrowed. She lowered herself against the car and waited for it to pass. It did pass after several minutes, and she told herself it had been nothing. But she knew it had not been nothing. Her doctor confirmed it was a warning event, the kind that precedes a more serious episode if nothing changes. He adjusted her prescriptions. He told her to watch her sodium. He sent her home. She sat in her kitchen that night, unable to stop crying. Not from fear alone, but from a specific kind of devastation that comes from having followed every rule and still arriving at the edge of something catastrophic. She began researching that same night. She read about the nitric oxide pathway. She read about the research on arterial stiffness and the foods that had been documented to address it. She read about the industrial oils she had been cooking with for decades and what happens to cholesterol when it absorbs chemically damaged fats from high-heat seed oil extraction. She became angry. The information had been there for years. It had been published. It had been documented. Nobody had handed it to her in a 12-minute appointment because the appointment was never designed to include it. She started the following morning. She blended raw beets with lemon juice and fresh ginger. The taste was still challenging, but she tolerated it because she was no longer thinking about her taste buds. She emptied her pantry of every bottle of soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, and every product containing them. She replaced them with grass-fed butter and a high-quality extra virgin olive oil stored in dark glass. She began drinking 3 cups of hibiscus tea daily, one with each meal. After reading a controlled study from a major American university showing that 6 weeks of consistent consumption produced a systolic blood pressure reduction comparable to a starting dose of standard antihypertensive medication. The plant compounds in hibiscus inhibit the same enzyme that the most commonly prescribed blood pressure drugs target, the enzyme that tightens blood vessel walls. The pharmaceutical industry built billion-dollar products to block that enzyme. The hibiscus flower does something similar for pennies per cup. By her second week, Irene noticed something she had not expected. Her feet, which had been perpetually cold for years, so cold she wore socks to bed in the middle of summer, were warm. Blood was reaching her extremities in a way it had not in years. Her home blood pressure readings, which she checked each morning, were shifting downward for the first time in 3 years. By week 4, she was seeing numbers she had not recorded in half a decade. At her 6-month follow-up, her cardiologist reviewed the results and asked what she had changed. She told him everything. He said he had not seen most of the research she was referencing. He said he had no clinical objection to continuing. He said the numbers spoke clearly enough on their own. Here is what you may not have been told about the oils that have been presented to you as heart-healthy for 40 years. In the 1960s, a major research institution conducted a controlled dietary trial in which animal fats were replaced with corn oil in thousands of patients over several years. The corn oil group successfully lowered their measured cholesterol values. They also showed a higher rate of mortality. The complete findings were not published until 2016, when researchers discovered the original data and released it through a leading medical journal. The industry had the data. They did not share it. They continued selling the products. They continued printing heart health symbols on the packaging of the same oils that their own suppressed findings had associated with increased mortality in older adults. Industrial seed oils, soybean, canola, corn, cottonseed, sunflower, are extraordinarily vulnerable to oxidation. When they're processed under high industrial heat, they arrive already damaged. When they enter the body and are absorbed into cholesterol particles, those particles become chemically toxic. The immune system identifies them as foreign. White blood cells attack them, die, and accumulate inside the artery wall as the hardened deposits that rupture into heart attacks and strokes. Daniel had been cooking with those oils for 30 years. He had been eating the margarine because his physician told him it was safer. He had avoided eggs, which were never the source of the problem, while consuming the actual source with every meal. And when the artery finally closed, the explanation offered was genetics. There are 2 more things worth knowing, both of them hiding in places most people have never considered. The white rind of a watermelon, the pale, tasteless part that virtually everyone discards after eating the red flesh, contains something called L-citrulline. You may have heard of L-arginine supplements marketed for cardiovascular support and nitric oxide production. The problem with those supplements is a simple physiological one. Oral L-arginine is largely metabolized by the liver before it reaches the bloodstream. It delivers almost no usable material to the cells that line your arteries. The supplement industry has known this for years. They continue selling it because the marketing language around nitric oxide resonates with health-conscious consumers. L-citrulline, however, bypasses the liver entirely. It travels to the kidneys and is converted into L-arginine directly inside the bloodstream, right where the endothelial cells of the artery wall can actually use it. Clinical trials published in a leading American hypertension journal showed that watermelon-derived compounds produced measurable reductions in aortic pressure and improvements in arterial flexibility. The mechanism was citrulline feeding the artery wall through the pathway that arginine supplements cannot access. You have been throwing away the medicine and buying the inferior substitute. Blend the white rind with lemon juice and a small amount of water. Drink it in the morning. Your arteries do not care that it came from the part of the watermelon you used to put in the garbage. And for anyone who cannot tolerate the taste of beetroot, there's a direct alternative with an even higher nitrate concentration. Arugula, the peppery salad green, contains up to 480 milligrams of dietary nitrates per 100 grams, which is measurably higher than most beetroot preparations. It activates the identical salivary bacteria bypass pathway. The nitrates convert on your tongue. The nitrites convert in the low-oxygen environment of your arteries. The vessels dilate. The pressure drops. The walls begin to regain flexibility. The taste is sharp and peppery rather than earthy and dense. For people with blood sugar concerns, arugula carries essentially no sugar, making it the preferred option when beet juice is not appropriate. Blend a generous handful with lemon juice and water. Drink it in the morning. Within 2 hours, the arterial relaxation effect is measurable. Here is what the timeline actually looks like when you begin consistently. In the first week, the blood pressure effect from the nitrate pathway is acute, meaning it occurs within 2 to 3 hours of consumption. Check your reading before you drink, and again 2 hours afterward. Some people see an immediate response. Others notice nothing dramatic in week 1. Both are normal depending on baseline arterial function. Between weeks 2 and 4, if you are consistent with a morning routine and have stopped the antibacterial mouthwash, your baseline readings will begin shifting. Not dramatically, but steadily. The numbers that were sitting at 150 begin appearing at 140, then 135. This is the artery wall beginning to remember how to relax. Between months 2 and 3, secondary effects often appear. Cold hands and feet that have been a persistent complaint for years begin to resolve as circulation improves. Walking endurance increases because oxygenated blood is reaching muscles more efficiently. Sleep quality sometimes improves as circulation to the brain normalizes. By month 6, the structural changes become measurable with clinical tools. Pulse wave velocity testing shows improvement in arterial stiffness. Endothelial function assessment shows the lining responding more effectively. The inflammatory environment that was driving plaque formation is controlled. What is happening is not symptom management. It is reversal of the underlying condition. When Daniel came back for his 6-month follow-up, his blood pressure was reading at 124/76. It had not been at that level in 15 years. His physician reduced the dosage on one of his medications. Not eliminated, reduced because the numbers had improved enough to warrant it. His pulse wave velocity assessment showed arteries that were measurably less stiff than they had been the morning after his cardiac event. He sat in the examination room and said something that stayed with me. He said that for 30 years he had trusted the map he was given, had followed every instruction printed on it, and that the map had led him to a hospital bed, and that everything he had learned afterward, the nitrate pathway, the salivary conversion, the oils, the mouthwash, none of it had come from the system that was supposed to be protecting him. It had come from him refusing to accept that someone who had done everything right could still end up that way, and then going looking for the reason himself. He said the difference now was that he finally had an accurate map, and that made it possible to actually move in the right direction. That is what this information is meant to be. Not a replacement for medical care. Not a reason to stop taking prescribed medications without physician involvement. But an accurate map, the one you deserve to have years ago, the one that should have been part of the conversation in every 12-minute appointment, but never was because the system was designed for management and not for reversal. The produce section of your grocery store has not changed. The beets are still there. The arugula is still there. The watermelon rind is still going into the garbage. The hibiscus flowers are still sitting in bulk tea bins that most people walk past without a second look. The olive oil, the real kind, with the harvest date on the label and the slight burn in the back of the throat that tells you the active compound is still present and alive, is still on the shelf. The information existed. Now you have it. The next step is yours.